Thanks, Camilo. Okay, so we are going to jump right in because we have a full morning. Our first talk this morning is Lev Kapitaikin, who is a lecturer in Islamic art at the art history department at Tel Aviv University. And his research focuses on issues of transculturation and visual hybridity in the arts of medieval Sicily from the 9th through the 13th centuries, exploring its connections to the Christian and Islamic Mediterranean, Eastern Islam, and Iran. He got his D.Phil from Oxford in 2012 with a dissertation that looked at the 12th century painted ceilings of the Capella Palatina in Palermo, which is what he will be talking to us about today. And he's in the process of transforming it into a book that will be published by Edinburgh University Press's series in Islamic art. So please join me in welcoming Lev Kapitaikin, who will be talking about, his title is Evoking Tales in a Medieval Ceiling, Sulayman, Solomon's Birds, and the Capella Palatina of Palermo. Welcome,
Lev. I wish firstly to thank Abigail Balbail for inviting me here. And at the outset, let me just say one thing. I don't wish to offend any of the Andalusians or the Maghribis among you, but Sicily, in a sense, is a branching out of the Maghreb or Andalus. It's both similar and both different, and this is something which one must keep in mind while looking at this, as you will see, I hope, quite fascinating material. A great multitude of birds populates the painted ceilings sheltering the Palatine Chapel of Palermo, constructed for King Roger of Sicily in the 40s. Like pigeons who stray into and wander through the railway halls of the industrial age, the Palatina birds appear to shelter and nest in the spacious caverns of the great muqarna ceiling of the nave. Since in one way or the other, every medieval building's cover were a symbolic projection of the sky, that pictorial architectural association of birds and ceilings at the Palatina is only a logical one. Across Islamic and Christian arts, birds often conveyed more than their mere birdly presence. The bird friezes in the two mired palaces of Khirbet al-Mafjar and Qusayr Amra have spatially indexed the sky and ideologically the alleged mastery of the Muslim ruler over the cosmos. Indeed, the cosmic tree of the world in medieval iconography had birds perched upon it. But factually, adorning Islamic ceilings with painted and carved birds seem to have been a widespread practice, as witnessed the woodwork of the Western Fatimid Palace at Cairo or the painted muqarnas from Fustat. A short distance from Sicily, across the Mediterranean, a poem of the Sicilian-born Ibn Hamdis portrayed a Hammadid palace at Buji of a ruler called al-Mansur, whose ceilings were painted and carved with birds. Quote, "When you look at the marvelous things in its ceiling, you see plentiful garden in the sky, and you marvel at its gold-colored swallows, that hover to construct their nests in its shelter. Its artisans apply their pens to it to show you each game animal as a painting." And this might as well, I think, apply to the Palatina. Ceilings like those of Cairo and Buji were likely to serve as models for the Palatina ceilings. Perhaps by punctuating the ceilings with birds nesting inside luxuriant vegetation, the chapel's designers deliberated such an illusionary effect that would expand the confined space of the Palatine Chapel. But instead of looking in today's lecture for the artistic models or provenances of the Palatina birds, I will be concerned today with how these seemingly mundane avians contribute to the weaving of royal ideologies around the chapel. Ideologies that stage the Norman king in the cast of the biblical Christian Islamic king, Sulayman, as naive or multicultural as this statement might sound today. Arguably, the birds nesting at the Palatina ceilings act as virtual insignia of Suleymanic kingship. I deliberately use the term Suleymanic in lieu of the usual Solomonic to refer to the body of Islamic notions and traditions concerning the King Sulayman, whether in the Quran, the Muslim Hadith, or in popular prophetic tales, which was different from both the biblical and the Christian Solomons. Islam has construed Sulayman as paramount model of power, wisdom, and justice. These virtues enabled him to comprehend the language of the birds and the beasts, to master ranks of demons and animals who constructed fabulous cities and monuments for him, and to travel on flying carpets or flying palaces, traversing immense distances in incredibly short time. Jacob Lassner, Priscilla Suchik, Valerie Gonzalez, and recently Allegra Jafrate extensively exploited such Suleymanic traditions and tales for reading in their light manifold Islamic artworks. Alongside familiar prophetic accounts by al-Tha'alibi in the early 11th century, the Suleymanic reading of the Palatina, I shall advance here, would utilize the earliest compilation in that genre by the Persian descended Umara ibn Wathima al-Farisi, who died in 902, and however spent most of his life in Egypt rather than in Iran. Umara's tales evince the fabulousness of his oeuvre, as in the following passage. Quote, God has set up for Sulayman a hall whose wall's length was 30 miles, and they were softer than eggs' shells. It sounds nicely. They were softer than eggs' shells. The hall had a roof, but had 1,000 supports that would be transformed into 100,000 demons who would perform various works. 70,000 birds spanned the roof of this hall. Unquote. Islamic and medieval art historians often overlook avian imagery, conceiving it something of an intermediate between vegetal and figural modes of representation. By exploring the Suleymanic intent of the Palatina birds, I hope to demonstrate that even repetitive bird imagery was important for evoking tales and constructing royal ideologies. Ultimately, it is the Christian Solomon ideology that permits all components of the Christian chapel that would justify reading also the Islamic Solomon into these ceilings. A Solomonic cast of the Palatina program was demonstrated by Ernst Kitzinger, Churchich, Eva Borsuk, and many others, so that a brief recapitulation of their conclusion should suffice. A Davidic Solomonic axis running across the chapel's length interlinks the sanctuary at its east end to the throne platform with the enthroned Christ above at the west end. Solomonic allusions in architecture, epigraphy, and mosaics converge upon the Palatina sanctuary and throne, construed respectively as symbolic replicas, in the Crowthamerian sense, of Solomon's temple and pillared hall of justice, where, to cite Psalm 12, are set thrones of judgment of the house of David. Mirko Vagnoni and Eva Borsuk have pointed out that the mosaic programs of Sicilian churches visualize Norman monarchic ideology, which staged Sicily's kings to emulate the biblical paragons of virtue David and Solomon. The Sicilian monarchy concomitantly propagandized the virtue of Solomonic justice that was famously epitomized in both Christian and Islamic Throne of Solomon and its Leonine pairs. The step throne platform and the mosaic backdrop in the Palatina West End were a symbolic restaging of Solomon's Throne of Justice. Although refurbished during the 18th century, the throne and its backdrop are generally thought to retain the original 12th century layout, with the Solomonic flanking lions in the mosaic. But the most tantalizing Solomonic allusion occurs at the sanctuary. By sanctuary I mean the choir, where a mosaic icon of Solomon is set just over the presentation in the temple on the western arch, separating it from the nave. At that focal juncture, Solomon's icon would appear to the clergy in the sanctuary, hovering on the same axis of the throne platform at its other western end. Such Solomonic staging of the whole ceremonial hall of the Palatina via visual access cannot but have been deliberate. It reads like a visual corollary pendant to the praiser Peter of Cluny heaped on Roger II around 1130 for establishing, quote, in Sicily a peaceful and happy kingdom like that of the peace-loving King Solomon. Greek, Latin, and Arabic panegyric extols alike the Sicilian monarch's virtues of wisdom, military strength, and justice, mimicking the proverbial Solomon, or Sulayman. Thus, the whole of the Palatina, sheltered by the Islamic wooden painted ceilings, was staged as Solomon's Hall of Justice, as I will try to show in this lecture. Enthroned at its west end on a Solomonic Leonine seat of his own, the Norman king would redress grievances and grant justice to Christians and Muslims alike, even against his own son, if one chooses to believe the 13th century Ibn al-Athir. Turning from the Christian mosaics and architecture upwards, one finds that the Solomonic bent of the entire chapel was extended equally to the Muqarnas ceiling. Yet here it is the Islamic Sulayman. Such notions of formula of an enthroned ruler with a pair of lions evokes textual ekphrasis of Sulayman's throne in Quranic exegesis and prophets' tales. Such textual sources were summarily explored in Allegra Euphrates' recent book, The Wandering Throne of Solomon. They portray the Sulaymanic throne as a complex machinery piece with automata sculptures of lions and various birds and trees, which all produce effects of movement, illumination, and sound. Sulayman's throne stood at the midst of a vast hall of the Majlis, his Majlis, stage in a kind of theatric performance. Its dramatized effects, performance hierarchy, crowdedness, movement, sound, and lighting were all deliberately calculated to instill admiration, dread, and ultimately wonder in its own audience, construing Sulayman as the supreme master of fabulous forces of nature and machinery at once. Hence, and very appropriately so, this occasion became known as the Majlis of Admiration and Dread, Majlis al-Rarba wal-Rahba. The descriptions of Sulayman's throne and Majlis in the 9th century Prophet's Tales by al-Farisi are striking in their imaginative and picturesque details. Quote, "The throne size was 7 miles, and it stood further 7 miles in the air. In each corner of the corners of the throne stood a 7 miles high golden lion. When Solomon used to preside over that majlis, he would be raised 9 miles above the people." And further we read, "Behind the throne there were a falcon, sakar in Arabic, of shining gold. When it spread its wings, the whole would twinkle with flashing lights of red, yellow, and green shades." A veritable concert or something, or a show. Such performative aspects of Sulayman's throne and majlis, involving elevated sills and platforms or colored twilights, would not be out of place in modern shows and concerts. Reimagining the medieval space of the Palatina with light is attested for contemporary Byzantine and Abbasid court ceremonial. Be that as it may, Islamic tales and ekphrases of Sulayman's throne and majlis were invoked within the Palatina's Muqarnas ceiling in two particular motifs. On this, what remains of this lecture will focus. And these motifs are the paired lions and the shading birds. First, however, it would be useful to recall to those who are not familiar with it the structure and the painting program in 45 centimeters. The three Palatina ceilings are the largest painted cycle, actually, to survive from medieval Islam. Incidentally, they are also the largest painting ceiling to survive in medieval Europe. One can think here of ceilings of Peterborough Cathedral, for example, or of the church in Zilis, which are much, much smaller. The paintings were done in tempera colors on a gesso primer, with deep blue, crimson red, and gold colors predominating, although the golden leaf has mostly deteriorated since. My investigation would focus on the great Muqarnas ceiling of the nave, responsible for the most striking visual impact of a limitless grotto. 95% of the paintings of this breathtaking ensemble consist of repetitive musicians and drinkers, nadims in Arabic, who are engaged in joyous and endless royal banquet or majlis in Arabic, tantamount in Islamic arts to the princely cycle. That majlis is presided by several frontal enthroned figures of kings, or perhaps kings of the earth. Once the Palatina ceilings are visualized to stage a vast banquet majlis presided by the kings, it is possible to construe certain key images as evocations of tales and anecdotes on ancient rulers and prophets being told and retold by Christian, Muslim, and Jewish attendees during these occasions. Turning to the Palatina's western wall once again, The Solomonic mosaic lines of the throne below are matched by another Sulaymanic, this time, pair of lines reconstructible at the west end of the Muqarnas ceiling, just above the same throne. The two relevant wedge-shaped niches at the corners of the ceilings were extensively damaged and repainted, so all what remains of the original paintings are headless quadrupeds with bulky bodies seated on their hind legs. Nevertheless, comparing these headless quadrupeds to the complete lions elsewhere in the ceiling establishes conclusively that these cannot but have been lions, frontal lions, and quite fearsome ones. The common nuances of the animal's thick neck, trunk, and overlapping fore and back legs prove this beyond the shade of doubt. Hopping through the Muqarnas caverns to the ceiling center on its south side, one encounters here a pair of crowned rulers with attendants set exactly on the latitudinal axis of the ceiling. The two majestic rulers, here they are, simply preside over the multitude of revelers celebrating the royal majlis across the ceiling. In the current case again, Sulayman's throne relic was invoked by a pair of conspicuous lions in the two larger panels that are set beneath and framing the two majestic rulers, just as is standard in other Islamic works of art. I hope you see them here. Here's one in profile and another one engaged in a very fearsome struggle with a dragon or a serpent on the right. Such spatial juxtaposition of the pair of rulers with a pair of throne lions effectively associate between the fearsome appearance of these men and these beasts. Indeed, contemporary sources highlight fearsome leonine continents to propose that the majestic rulers are idealistic or portrait. Another possibility should be considered, namely that the rulers' pair evoke Sulayman presiding over his majlis in the ceiling, or alternatively the King Roger II in the guise of Sulayman. In fact, the hairy faces and bulky bodies of the two rulers depicted in the ceilings, who don't ornament man's physical traits as detailed in Islamic prophets' tales. Quote, a fair-skinned man of white complexion, corpulent, hairy, who used to wear white clothes. The spatial setting of the two enthroned rulers at the ceiling's exact center with the lions underneath resonates with potent notions of Sulaymanic justice. The focal setting of the rulers at the symbolic nexus of the Palatina ceiling might echo a Muslim tradition stating, "It is fitting that the throne of the just king to be rooted firmly in the navel of the earth." But why two rulers and not one? Why is this duplication? I believe the doubling of rulers is also meaningful, a visual resonance of a booming royal title, the King of the East and the West. At the specific, it would evoke Sulayman's encompassing poles. God has specifically for the Andalusians that extended from al-Andalus to Istakhar or Persepolis. Some say that he possessed the whole of earth. It is perhaps in gratitude and in acknowledgement of the Sulaymans of the heavens in wistful gazes of wisdom and piety to God. I'm getting now finally to the birds, who assume, however, their Sulaymanic meaning only within the larger staging of Sulayman's throne at the Palatina ceiling. The lions of the throne act as an icon of justice across all monotheistic traditions of the throne. By contrast, the birds hallmark only the Islamic and the Jewish traditions of the throne. In the case of the birds of the throne, we're not dealing with real avians, but with moving sculpture, in other words, automata, just as with the lions of the throne. These bird automata, that various versions alternately have as eagles, vultures, falcons, or peacocks, are usually described as being gold-made and jade inset, set above or at the top of Sulayman's throne in confronted pattern. Apparently, when wind blew into the falcon, it would spread its wings, and when it intended joining its wings one to another, the wind would blow out of it. Another Shii commentator in the 12th century, which is closer to us, says, when Solomon mounted his throne, the pair of vultures would spread their wings and shade him from the sun. Thalibi's version in the 11th century also makes the vultures automata to sprinkle musk and ambergris upon the king, while Islamic, which he reads. Other components of the Islamic Sulayman's throne have their sources in biblical accounts, especially in the 7th century second who hover over the ruler's head is one of the most characteristic themes in Solomonic imagery. As much as the lions of Sulayman's throne, so also its shading birds, as I term this motif, acted as insignia of kingship. This is manifested in the famous tale of Sulayman's magic signet ring, which harbored the source of his extraordinary power and kingship. After Sulayman is his magic ring from a fish belly, he places it upon his finger, quote, descended upon him. That's very Subsequently, the same prodigy is repeated when the king recovers back his magic ring after it is stolen by a pretender demon. I think that at a deeper level, the lions and the birds of Sulayman's throne reference the cosmocratic king's respective dominances of the sphere, the earth, and the air. So on, were reenacted at the Palatina ceiling in front platform at the west end of the chapel. Again, I always return there. The whole program of the chapel. The two antithetic birds pairs extend each one of their wings, keeping the other wing closed, as you can see here and also perhaps better here. The peculiar golden coloration of these avians, as well as the rather mechanical manner they extend one wing, hint that they do not represent real birds at all. They emulate throne automata, pairs of duration of a wooden carving, two peacocks spreading each single wing over his throne. Although of mediocre quality, the Cairan wood carving may read like a symbolic representation of Sulayman's throne. By the same token, the beautiful peacock, you can see it down here, I hope, in the right. Here it is. Would allude call to justice in tales. In fact, looking again at the backdrop of the platform, one discovers therein another Solomonic bird allusion unnoticed so far. The spandrels of the backdrop are filled in by mosaics of birds perched on vegetal scrolls who tend also to be arranged in pairs. When the monarch presumably took his place on the throne, the birds perched spatial ends. Such bird flock surrounding the ruler's head brings to mind the intimacy birds enjoyed with Solomon, murmuring into his ear. Surely another Sulaymanic allusion. In Sulaymanic tales, birds are commonly charged with two main roles. Firstly, like other members, humans, demons, and animals in his retinue, the birds also perform the roles of courtiers and paladins, acting in the king's names. Witness the famous hoopoe as a diplomatic emissary to the Queen of Sheba. Secondly, real shading birds provide shelter and when those are on the move. He is thus in a flying glass palace / a city over them. Sulayman's paladin birds might be occurring also in the Palatina ceilings. Two images feature a seated prince with drinking vessel flanked by gentle-looking birds pair. Almost seeming to perch upon the prince's shoulder, murmuring into his ears, this imagery connotes a powerful sense of intimacy between the ruler and his birds. That iconographic motif of a 12th-13th century meteorite by Iranian or Jaziran bronze mirror at the Met, the bird is also surrounded by Ranksiman presiding over his majlis of jinns and birds. Yet another variation of that motif presents the ruler within a mihrab-like niche, flanked by a pair of larger and grosser birds. I conjecture that such a composition once also occurred at the exact center of the west side of the ceiling, above the status of Sulayman's paladins, or position of these avians in relation to the enthroned ruler is that of his trusted guards or paladins. The last noteworthy peculiarity occurring in both the paladin and other birds in the ceilings is the horned ears, which convey their supernatural fabulous being. You can see it here or here. Due to the limits of times and space, I can only briefly address the because it has in a sense. With Matteo, this distinctive bird type, it with the fabulous Anka. As early as the 5th century CE, the peculiar horned-eared bird features on a funerary vase from Merv, and it is to be seen intermittently also in Umayyad and Sasanian royal arts. During the 10th, 11th centuries, it was also naively and popularly depicted on slip-painted pottery from eastern Iran. Most intriguingly, the Iranian horned-eared bird features also in that period on a church screen in links, or just one of them in the air. That such shading birds usually occupy the uppermost zone of the ceiling suggests the idea of these avians shading at the protecting the human figures who seek shelter beneath their extended wings in its cavities. And this notion of shading or protecting, which is beneficial, is something which is very built into this ceiling. One particularly evocative composition features a pair of birds naturalistically flapping their wings over an enthroned ruler with attendants inside a domed building. Perhaps not accidentally, this mode of representation of shading beds were especially popular with Fatimid and almost last the Muqarnas cornice, the hanging support of the domelets in the style. The shading beds here, these are the domelets in the uppermost part of the ceiling. The shading beds almost act like avian caryatids, which hanging, unlike in classical architecture, occupying the sphere immediately below the heaven. Such spatial configuration suggests the idea of an avian canopy formed of real shading beds. Especially when Sulayman used to travel with his retinue in his wind-borne palace, the beds would form a dense canopy to shade the structure and its passengers from the sun on the go. Quote, a poem, beds shading them rank upon rank above, flattering above them the whole journey long. Unquote. The Suleymanic avian canopy was visualized in a setting the king amongst his court of jinns and sheltered by a dense flock of birds. Much earlier prophets' tales that were transmitted even as late as that. Perhaps this notion of shifting avian canopy was rooted in the natural phenomena of ordered bird flocks. I have not much. I have still the time? Yes? Okay. I don't have really much, in any case. I have like 2 pages. An avian canopy actually becomes a Suleymanic sign right from the inception of his reign. A tradition cites, quote, after Daoud or David was washed and wrapped, the sun rose over him. Solomon said to the birds, gave shade to the bed. They gave him shade until the earth was dark. To the birds, take wing by wing. Abu Huraira, a famous companion of the Prophet, says, the Prophet Muhammad showed how the birds did this. He held his hand, how the falcons with long wings covered him that day. I wouldn't do it because, That particular instance of the avian canopy is traceable back to Midrashic sources. The 5th century David is over David's beer. Covering, sheltering Byzantine constructs of kingship. A visual affiliation exists between the 4 prey birds spreading a wing over the western front of the Palatina and between the pairs of imperial eagles likewise sheltering Rex David on the consular diptych of Monza. In Armenian Alexander romances, eagles hover over Alexander. Of the Byzantine emperor Basil the Macedonian, it was related that as a newborn an eagle sheltered him from the sun while his parents worked in the field to portend his rise to imperial rule. The scene was moreover illustrated in the lavish Byzantine Madrid skilices produced for the Sicilian kings. The Romano-Byzantine notion of the imperial hovering eagle was also reverberated in Islamic anecdotes on hunting. Quote, according to the ceremonial of the Visigothic kings of peregrine falcons, used to circle around his head, alternated not seizing Roman imperial eagle with the Near Eastern parasol, a venerable insignia of cosmic kingship. No, wait. I still have something more to say, something small. In lieu of conclusion, let us look Muqarnas ceiling, noting its mediomatic and visual effects of the ceiling, notwithstanding Its visual appearance forestalls gaze, preempts recognition of individual imageries and structures, and how all this grandiose apparatus was accomplished and suspended in the air. For all what the medieval viewer knew of Sulayman's or genes, just as were Sulayman's flying palace. Alternately described as a gold-woven silken carpet, or a wooden raft, or an elaborate glass tube structures, kawarir in Arabic, Sulayman's flying palace typically incorporated domes or pavilions, roofed chambers, niches, and even kitchens, bakeries, latrines, and stables. Its multi-storied construction supported on piers or as architectural terms could have been used in medieval times to describe actually the Palatina ceiling. The tales of Sulayman's airborne palace circulated also in Sicily and specifically at Roger's court is evidenced by the court geographer El-Idrisi stating, "It is related in the traditions that Sulayman ibn Daud used to travel from Tiberias to Persepolis from the morning till the evening." I should like to conclude, but just by looking at the Palatina again and inspect with a fresh eye architectural emulation of such notions as domes, kebab, maharib, mihrabs, and so on, and spatial simulation that ultimately I think involves a certain transparency, interpenetrability of planes which for the viewer, as much as he could see, would be very confusing and disorienting. A grand project like the Palatina, that's the last bit. Three lines. A grand project like the Palatina in its Muqarnas ceiling must have involved making a series of informed ideological, architectural, and artistic choices. Staging Roger in a Christian chapel as a Muslim Sulayman might seem like an inner paradox. But in the same period as the Palatina of Sicily was built, the Crusade had no qualms about reimagining the Dome of the Rock as Templum Salomonis, although they knew well of its actual Muslim origin. The evocation of Sulayman's Justice Hall and Flying Palace, respectively, in the Palatina Hall and Muqarnas ceiling and its shading bears elegant testimony to the powers of imagery and imagination in bridging Islamic and Christian royal ideologies at the Western Mediterranean.